Right, good afternoon everyone. Thank you for joining us on a sweltering afternoon in Southwark Park. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you John Walter, the artist. I hope you've seen both parts of his exhibition, Capsid, which spans both our galleries here at CGP. Both halves of the show will be open until 6 o'clock tonight, so if you've not caught Dalston yet, nip over there after the talk. And Jonathan P. Watts, who's contributed an amazing essay in the Capsid book, which is available for sale in the bookshop area, should you like to buy one, to mark the end of the show. John might even sign it for you. Yeah. Capsid is brought to us with great thanks to our friends at the Wellcome Trust, Arts Council England, Omnicolour and Home in Manchester. And we're really, truly sorry this is the last day. It's been an epic, thank you. So we'll maybe talk about half an hour, 40 minutes, and then do some questions at the end. All right?
Thank you. Very good. So I thought I'd just give a sort of introductory framing of how I met John, and then we'll talk about the work. Met John, or John contacted me, in fact, via our friend Benedict Drew about 4 years ago, and I'd written an article for Freeze magazine, which was it was a kind of bringing together of two exhibitions and events that happened simultaneously in London. One of them was this exhibition that some of you may have seen at Chisenhale Gallery in East London, called Raspberry Poser by Jordan Wolfson. And the other one was this event at King's College, London, where Simon Watney introduced a 24-hour loop screening of Derek Jarman's film Angelic Conversation. And if you saw the Wolfson film, you'll know that the film consists of a figure, I think it's Wolfson himself, posing as a punk, and it's intercut with these images of Manhattan streets that were formerly kind of gay neighbourhoods, queer neighbourhoods, that are overlaid with animations of HIV viruses bouncing through luxury apartments and so on. And at the same time, this event at King's College that Simon Watney spoke at was a kind of testimonial, really, a kind of memory exercise, remembering friends that he and his peer group had lost to AIDS-related illness. And there was a terrible sadness, and I was very struck by this, at the kind of really profound trauma, really, of somebody that I know personally losing many friends of their community and peer group. And it seemed that there was a certain kind of glibness in Wolfson's work, a kind of willful ahistoricism that just saw this material as something to make use of, and not really have a kind of conversation about or take responsibility for. And so I just wrote this thing that brought these two things together. And John wrote to me and said that he was very interested in this article. And it was about this time that a friend of mine, who's a really wonderful curator, Mason Lever-Yap, also gave me this book called Gentrification of the Mind by Sarah Schulman that some of you may be aware of. And this was very helpful, really, in thinking about Wolfson's work, because one of the kind of main theses in this is that that history has, particularly in the States, in North America, has been gentrified in itself, that there's a kind of erosion of memory, and the fiercely political terms of that surrounded AIDS activism at the time had been kind of washed over, had been kind of painted over, and had been appropriated and taken on by, was able to have been taken on by right-wing politicians who could claim that actually they'd done a lot for gay rights, when in fact they'd inflicted the deepest cuts, really. And so that's the context. And I met John at the Whitstable Biennial, where he'd made this wonderful installation right on the seafront there called Turn My Oyster Up. And some of you may have seen it, but it included things like tarot readings and drinks and John talking and this kind of very convivial setting. And it was a kind of total environment in a shed. And it was interesting to read in this publication, Capsid, which is available to buy, that you kind of talk about that installation as being a very significant moment for you in terms of anticipating what followed, because you say that it provided a kind of context for lots of different things that you were doing. And that's the year before Alien Sex Club took place, which in a way we need to talk about in order to make sense of Capsid here. Yeah. So I wonder if you could just tell me a bit about what you meant by this idea of it being a kind of context for...
So I suppose my contacting you and the resonance of the Poserpunks article was that I was beginning to think about HIV as a subject in art and historically, and how it might be being treated in an outmoded way or an old-fashioned way by my contemporaries, and you seem to have hit on something that needed further investigation and that I was thinking about writing within my research. And Alien Sex Club sort of conglomerated as this installation that was really looking at the cultures around HIV, the cultural factors around HIV to do with risk and the spaces of sex and perception of the sort of complexity of HIV as a web, and using a different vocabulary visually to describe that than had dominated the discussion to this point, which was a post-minimalist one. So to sort of say, well, Fierce Gonzalez Torres is great, but that's to do with something in the 90s that doesn't exist anymore because we have treatment and we have slightly different social factors that include the internet and so on and so on. And so maybe this discussion needs updating visually. So that's what Alien Sex Club became. And it was there's a chunk of it on show at the Welcome at the moment in the Somewhere in Between show. And that's really another version of the show that was in 2015. And the Whitstable Biennial work was feeding into that. It was a way of beginning to research that and make a little world. I mean, I'd made bars previously, but that was a really successful one in that it was a complete immersion, in the way that this room is a complete immersion. Well, it doesn't have a ceiling. Well, it has a ceiling, but it doesn't have a ceiling I made. It worked. You know, people got it. It was it was active, and what were we talking about? The sort of context for this. Oh yes, making a context for the work. So I suppose one of the things underpinning the work over the past 10 years has been where does the work live? You know, when you make this stuff, where does it go? You've got this studio and you do this stuff and you're interested, and then there's this activity. But what is the environment that this will live in, discursively, physically, and I've been testing that in various places through hospitality, through working with scientists, through working with architects, and now I'm working in these kind of contexts, which we can call museums or galleries or whatever this building is, that sort of the thing justifies itself almost by nature of the architecture, but actually that's not always been available to me leading up to this point. So I've had to take responsibility for making the place for the work to live by embedding it in other worlds, other discussions, other people's work, other ideas that maybe aren't artistic either, that are maybe to do with different modes of display or knowledge or things like this, which it wouldn't be everybody's cup of tea or approach to solving the problem. They would just sort of wait it out.
Yeah, yeah.
So that, yes, that's the context for this in a way.
Yeah. You mentioned Gonzalez Torres, who's a kind of sainted artist and is a kind of celebrated for a kind of mournful minimalism. And you talked about this idea just now about the kind of need to reinvent that.
Yes.
Why is there a need to reinvent that?
So, well, I termed it queer minimalism because I identified that this was a strain that was going on internationally in the work of people like Prem Sahib here, or Chris Acquay in New York, referring really to not just Gonzalez, or actually Park MacArthur, who had a show at Chisenhale, which is to do with a kind of disability and queer aesthetic as well. So that's why I've termed it queer minimalism, because it seems to be using this minimalist vocabulary or post-minimalist vocabulary to address queer subjects has become a sort of formula or a package or a received way of doing something. And seeing that pattern seemed to me enough of a reason not to do it anyway, but also it didn't feel fit for purpose for me, in the sense that the discussion, the subject matter seemed to still be alive, but everyone had forgotten that somehow, or that had slipped under the radar. And so, you know, it measurably since 2015, things have changed. But at that moment in time, there was suddenly this spike of rates of HIV transmission in the West, in big cities like London and New York and Paris, which was to do with chemsex and the way that people were using drugs and sex simultaneously. And that was suddenly an epidemic that has died down again now because of the way practices have changed around the use of PrEP and access. You know, the discussion has shifted, and Capsid also reflects that shift in my mind. So I felt that there was a purpose to making Alien Sex Club beyond just an artistic one. Not that it was activism in some, it wasn't ACT UP, yes. It was a different kind of activism,
yes.
And it was more complicated than that, in that
yes.
it was, it plugged into lots of different groups, places, people, sexual health centres, practitioners, clinicians, all, you know, but that was its success, was that it was rhizomatic, if you like.
It's interesting because you, it's interesting because you know you had this shed in the middle of Alien Sex Club.
Yeah,
you know.
Sheds recur.
And you know, people could take an HIV test in there, and you know you link up with organisations that are non-artistic organisations. So like you say, it's rhizomatic in that sense. And this kind of links to something that you said earlier about this idea of, you know, how do you, as an artist, how do you make work in a non-artistic setting?
Yes.
You know, what kind of challenges does that present? And I guess it makes me think about, to come on to this very significant part of your work, about what it is to work with scientists. For instance, there is a scientist in the room, I'm told.
Two scientists.
Two scientists in the room. Because there's this very nice, in Greg Towers' very succinct and clear, Professor Greg Towers' very succinct and clear introduction. It's this very nice passage where he says that we were both surprised at our common interests, but went on to discover how similar the goals of science and art are. Both are creative enterprises, both are underpinned by curiosity. We both aim to do something original and innovative that engages, entertains, and excites our audience. It was this kind of moment in contemporary art, maybe 15 years ago, where artists would just make a microscopic image of a cell and then put it in a gallery and say that it was interesting. And it seems to me that it's more than seeming. That's not what you do.
Yes.
So if you could say a bit more about, try and characterise what that relationship has been like. I mean, what the terms of engagement have been like.
So I mean, that's a good example of what we've been working away from.
Right.
And that has been a point of discussion. We sort of term it as the fly's eye syndrome.
Okay.
You get these amazing microscopic tinted images which claim to be factual, but are actually as fictitious as me drawing from life.
Yeah.
In the sense that this is a mode of display and an invention, and it's rhetorical and highly misleading.
It's
potentially.
sciencey.
Yeah, it's science. It's jazzy looking, and it's boring because it's so repetitive.
Yeah.
And unimaginative. And so the point of my collaboration with Greg and the lab is that I'm imaginatively involved in the narratives and the language and the science and the imagery that's being generated in a much broader way. I'm not there to illustrate what Greg is doing. That could be one of the things I do. In terms of the life cycle animation that's in there, that was a way of straightening out what the contribution of Greg and his team's work is to updating the science beyond what we knew even during Alien Sex Club. So that's but then that's a leaping off point for other things. And so it's a collaboration that couldn't have happened 10 years ago for me, because I wouldn't have had the skills, and I've learned a lot of the skills of how to work with Greg through working with Alison Roger, who I worked with on Alien Sex Club. So it's cumulative, and I think that then it's about conversation. This isn't a collaboration which is hands-on in the sense of we're not making stuff physically together, but we're discussing stuff and exchanging ideas and questioning each other's work for the better. And it's a lot about narratives, I think, and that's where art and science are very similar, is that they generate, hypotheses are generated through narratives, and if you change the narrative, you change the hypothesis. If you change the metaphor, you change the hypothesis. One of the big metaphors in Capsid is this idea of the cloak, the invisibility cloak, that the Capsid interacts with its environment to disguise itself, or the environment disguise, whatever that is. But that has bias, that metaphor, and that liberates the science and it restricts the science, and that can liberate the art or restrict it. And I just think that we both acknowledge these things are going on is very exciting, and also there's a belief at a certain point in what we're both doing. I think that we are doing similar things, even though we're not. These are different disciplines that have different traditions. But my hunch has always been, and this is partly because how I've been taught, studying anatomy at Oxford, and believing that there's a kind of artist and scientist, polymath, Renaissance person. That's fed a lot into the conversation and the possibilities of the conversation, because I believe that there are overlaps. Now, not everybody would approach it in that way.
I wonder what that means if you work with somebody like The Welcome, in terms of knowledge production, what the kind of obligations you have as an artist are, and that might be ethical obligations, for instance.
Yeah, I think that one of the things we're both aware of. I mean, we're both funded by Welcome, and a lot of artists are funded by Welcome, and a lot of projects. There is a genre of art science collaborations that this also intervenes in potentially, and that's part of its agenda. And however anything is funded dictates the terms of engagement or the power structures that it has to negotiate. If you're working for Welcome are a client at a certain level. They have an agenda. I have an agenda. Greg has an agenda. We've all got to negotiate these things together to make a happy outcome, and that's not to water it down. That's to sort of say, well, these things can galvanise each other, and they can be useful to each other. So, for me, it's useful to have this overarching narrative of the science to insert my work into, which is incredibly tangential and full of other stories and other images and subtexts and things that aren't directly connected to the science, but that allow other people in, other things in, that make it non-illustrative, that tie it to, I mean, as we were talking about before, we were talking in front of everybody, that bring autobiography in, that locate it in a particular space and time of now, that hopefully make it resonate or make it feel genuine. But having that context of the science is really useful for me, because otherwise there's no hook for the thing. I need that hook.
In terms of the kind of action of the capsid, perhaps you could tell us a bit more about how it functions, because as you've suggested already, it cloaks itself, which, like you say, it's a metaphor. There's a certain prejudice or bias within that use of metaphor, but suddenly the idea of cloaking helps us think about ideas of identity, about masquerading, about visibilities, invisibilities, strategic visibilities and strategic invisibilities. So perhaps you could tell us a bit more about the action of the capsid and how that's informed.
So my knowledge of the capsid grew directly out of Alien Sex Club and looking inside the virus. So if one of the questions was, how do you update the representation of HIV, one way to do that might be just to go inside it. And then you find that there's this thing called a capsid, which is another protein structure inside the envelope, which in the case of a different virus or a simpler virus like a common cold might be spherical, but in the case of a retrovirus and HIV in particular has this peculiar cone-shaped thing, which is structurally very exciting. Yeah, there we go. My cartoon version of it. So I became, before I met Greg, I became very interested in the structural properties of it and built models of it with cardboard, which is something that the scientists haven't done. They work in computers, and that was something to bring to the conversation. But and I spoke to a group of HIV doctors on Wednesday about this. The way all the drugs work at the moment doesn't acknowledge, it doesn't know this research. So the assumption is that the virus attaches onto the cell and the capsid is inserted into it and breaks up immediately. Right. Well, actually, what Greg and the group are showing is that, or proposing and demonstrating, is that the capsid is a container for genetic material that needs to protect it and also fuel it to move and to turn the RNA that it has inside it into DNA. So it's a purposeful capsule that has business to do. Yeah. And it's a question of numbers, and some are probably dodgy and don't work, and some do. But what's important is that this is on a nano level, and you very articulately describe it as a nano cabaret in the essay, which I wish I'd thought of. But it's what seems exciting about the cloaking notion to me is that there is this interaction going on between virus and host. So it's not just that one thing dominates the other. There's a sneakiness to it. So the capsid is the successful capsid, let's say, is somehow working with the cytoplasm, the environment between the cell wall and the nucleus, to hide it, potentially hold it together, to dialogue with parts of the cell, the nuclear pore. And so it's got all these interactions going on that suppress the innate sensing mechanisms of the cell from killing it. And these kind of stories and notions seem to me to have implications on how we think about all our relationships, about how we act politically as human beings, in friendships, at work, in the world, how we think about ourselves. And the ramifications of this maybe don't become manifest fully in Capsid, maybe they're things that are followed up later on, but the talk about identity politics that has been going on in recent times, I'm suspicious of, And I wonder whether this kind of capsid science has something to teach us about that, because I think that the inveigling, the corruption, the bargaining that goes on in all of this infection, in order to continue something, in order to breed something, is a more honest. I don't know. There's something in it that's very exciting that I touch on in the film, and but it's not. It's that I'm just on the scent of something. I don't know if that makes any sense.
It'd be good to kind of return to the film, because it's a very significant new body of work for you, piece of work for you. But this I was very struck by in researching my text. Oh, and by the way, you can have Nano Cabaret.
Thank you.
If you want it, you can.
Brilliant. Thank you.
I was very struck at the complexity and multiply authored visualizations of capsids and of cells. And I also was, in the catalogue, I was writing about this one particularly famous image that appeared on the front cover of Time magazine, 1983 or 1984 or whatever it was, which was a single black and white photographic image. So in terms of kind of charting a kind of visual culture, if you like, or visual technology, you go from this singular image, which becomes a kind of spectacle of horror, to something that is multiply authored by hundreds and hundreds of researchers. So in other words, there's something very interesting in that multiplicity of authorship that speaks to your work.
Yes.
And you go into the space here, and it seems visually chaotic.
Yes.
I suspect it isn't.
Yes. Well, we've touched on this before, but what is misunderstood about maximalism is it's not chaotic. It's absolutely ordered, in the sense of.
But what's maximalism? Sorry,
I refer to what I do as maximalist in the sense not only is it clearly not minimalist, but it's not just that it's the opposite of minimalism, which actually probably isn't. It's the work is made serially. So what you start to see is that there's 10 of something, or there's 20 of something, and within each series there's a set of constants and a set of variables, in the same way you would set up an experiment. And that's so there's actually in Capsid there's 250 works, and within that there's 22 series.
Right.
When they're collapsed together and broken apart and reorganised, they become a bigger thing that looks messier, or it's overwhelming. But actually within that there's an order. I mean, I want that overwhelmingness for myself and for you.
Yeah.
But it's not made in a chaotic way.
No.
And so the other way the way I've begun to think about maximalism is that really it's related to thinking about complex adjusting systems, which is really a branch of science that's thinking about algorithms in nature and computing and economics. And there's a tenet in there that says more is different. And what that really means is that there are opportunities that occur when something spreads just by dint of numbers, really, and a proliferation of niches is the way that it's described, that opportunities open up. And this is the way my work works, is that things breed and new niches appear to be mined of either by me or by somebody else later on. And that is not an uncritical process, it's just a highly generative one.
Yes. I mean, I refer to it as a kind of mindless production or mindless proliferation, which actually thinking about it, I mean, it's clearly not mindless, but what I mean, it has a precedent. You know, if you think about general ideas,
Yes.
AIDS, you know, this is the metaphor of virulency.
Yes.
Is about this kind of non-narrative, mindless proliferation, which are attracted to. But sorry.
Yeah, I'm an image breeder.
Yeah.
That's how I've always thought of myself. And the underlying thing is about combining different particles, i.e. images or objects, together to make new types, new particles, making new bonds between things that haven't existed before. And they can be on a very small level or a very, very big and complex level. And that is a way of opening up new lines of inquiry. It's not mindless in the sense that there is the rational element is sublimated within play. So all of the, you know, there's a video in there, there's a list of words.
Oh yes.
Laura's mutants,
Yeah.
it's called, named after a particular strain of virus that gets referred to in the lab a lot. And I gravitate towards language and jargon, which then can be translated into images, and then I can deal just with the images. And in allowing myself just to make visual equations, that frees my brain of the burden of the rational to get on with the fun. And then the really interesting stuff happens that can be taken back into the rational later. So, and that's the other reason to work in multiplicity. So at scale, in terms of quantity, I mean, because that dislodges me enough to just do it without thinking too much, which is not the way everyone would work. But I'm not trying to control the meaning at that point. That's where it can fall underneath this bigger umbrella of the science or the subject matter.
Or the cosmology of Alien Sex Club and Capsid, and this kind of, you know, this vast encyclopedic mapping of iconologies. It's very clear that you are also a great fan of painting.
Yes.
And I can see a kind of, I mean, I suppose in this kind of art historical formulation of maximalism by Robert Pincus Whittle in the early 80s, it didn't seem to catch on, but he was looking at people like, I don't know, Saleh and, you know, this generation of what we now understand as being kind of postmodern painting that freely sampled from lots of different places. Who do you admire?
I mean, there's only two people that really talk properly about maximalism. One is Pincus Whitton, who really theorises it as what we might refer to as trans-avant-garde, so Baselitz, Schnabel. It really neo-expressionist figurative painting in the early 80s, which is a reaction against post-minimalism. He's talking about it in that very, very limited sense. So it's actually highly conservative in his reading. Then you've got Dougie Fields, who talks about it as minimalism with a plus, plus, plus. I'm all right, I'm double fisted. Minimalism with a plus, 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 which is also very reductive because it refers it back to minimalism again, which is potentially much broader than that, or more independent than that. So, but yes, I'm trying to fathom a definition of it as I go along, which may not be resolvable or interesting, but somehow is a theme in my thinking. And yes, for me, Sally and Polka and De Chirico, and you know, there's a trajectory within which, or a history of certain painting that my work operates within, and John's, and codification and hermetics that I'm trying to play with and extend and vary from. And the work is all pictorial. It's all to do with painting and the space of the picture plane, which even the moving image work is to do with that. It's not film. I don't come from narrative cinema. I bring colour field painting, Jules Olitsky, 60s American painting, Kenneth Noland, Frankenthaler. All those are that's the soil within which the work begins, and you know, these paintings in this space on the wall, the rectangular ones, which are called the innate sensing mechanisms, you know, they're directly dealing with Kippenberger, and they're growing out of the research that I've done through Schonke into my own production values. So, yeah.
There's a kind of what characterises, say, Sally as that kind of that breaking down of what suitable content might be for a painting.
Yes.
That, you know, that very much is looking out at the kind of spectacular image world, and there's a kind of collapsing of those, of the high and the low, and the artistic and the non-artistic, and in other words, a kind of levelling of hierarchies of value.
Yeah. Which actually becomes another hierarchy.
Yes. But there's a certain, so you share in that sense a certain kind of promiscuity, and also this promiscuity between what we might think of as separate discourses or separate fields of speciality.
Yeah. So there's this idea of the hybrid.
Lost the thread, yeah.
Yeah, promiscuity, not only in terms of media and images, but also in terms of practices and collaborations.
Yes, yeah, that was where I was going to go. I was going to ask you specifically about making.
Yes.
Because there is also a promiscuity about the way that you move between different media.
Right.
So you'll fabricate a model.
Yes.
You know, make a 3D scan of it, put it in the computer, bring it out again, and particularly over in the church, you know, these steel sculptures that are leaning up against the wall. I mean, you talk about that as a form of drawing. I mean, my immediate response would be that it was a sculpture.
Right. Yeah.
So there's more of an observation on my part.
So, you know, in these metal screens, which they're made using a plasma cutter,
right.
So you're firing this line through sheet steel and the way that the tool controls your hand, it immediately disables you from making a straight line. I mean, you're not a computer. I'm not a laser cutter.
Yes.
So there's a wobble that you either go with or you don't. And I go with it because that seems to me to be a constraint that's to be exploited. And that is a philosophy that underpins how it's all done, which is inherited from Schnabel's. It always comes up in all the talks we do. Schnabel's velvet paintings, which are a way of disabling his drawing.
Yes. And
so in these 22 series, from 1 to 22, even though it's not just, you know, I don't know that's what it will be at the start. Looking back retrospectively, what I can say is that there are mutations that go on when an image jumps from one medium to the next, into the virtual space, back to a watercolour, onto a lumpy painting, into a video as a prop. That these are tests of the image that harden it, liquefy it, sublimate it, and as it goes on, it changes its meaning, it changes its shape, it changes its scale, its colour, and it takes on different values. And it's in a lot of ways it's nothing. It's just a device. You know, it might be a Triskelion shape, but it may, you know, you bring your meaning to it too. And so I refer to it as jumping species in the sense that each of these different media is a species, which it isn't. But they have their own traditions or discussions and ways of working. And the challenge is to swap information from one to the other. You know, how do you swap information from virtual reality into a watercolour? I mean, you can't. But you can, it turns out, in this very strange way. and that's the way the thing moves forward. And then you're just you're discovering new space by inventing it.
Can I ask you in a very sort of straightforward way about how you approached Capsid's installation here and over at the church? Because the church is a very sort of it's a very imposing space, I suppose is the way of putting it. It's historically very loaded. It also has hosted many exhibitions. As it is a church, a deconsecrated church, obviously there are echoes of spirituality and certain aesthetic responses that are associated with that. Could you talk about how you approach both of these spaces?
So there's lots of things I suppose that feed into it. I've done some other shows in churches. Weirdly, I did a show in a chapel in Bologna. I did a church as a child, as a teenager, in a real church, a functioning church. So this is a habitual thing. No, but the work I'd done for Alien Sex Club in my academic research really enabled me to take on a project like this, in the sense that I've thought about spatial design as a curator, really, and taken that further in Shonky, and had to work with the architecture that is given to me, and just you have a choice as to whether you work with or against it, in the same way that you might use the texture of wood and the knots in the wood to suggest shapes or obliterate them. And also I've had the advantage of following the programme here and seeing Jonathan's show and seeing other shows in both spaces and how they have tackled the space. So knowing what the audience will expect or not expect, and also how to vary from that. So with Dilston, it's very, very potent, like you say, and you can't start building in there. And, well, you can at great cost and sort of idiocy. I mean, it would be dumb to hide it. And I think this goes back to Shonky, in the sense of you play to your strengths and you expose the idiosyncrasies. So I also didn't want this to be Alien Sex Club 2.0, but so we've strung cables up that become a way of echoing the sequencing of the space and allowing you a journey to get to the film. And you hear the film before you get to it, so you know something's coming. And you could put the film somewhere other than the altar, but it's the obvious space to put it. So it goes there. You don't fight that, and things find their own space in a way. And for example, we haven't shown any of the costumes here, but when the show is reiterated in Home in Manchester, probably there'll be mannequins with the, I'll have to bring these two spaces together.
Yes.
So the other big decision was about the floor, and that sort of dictated itself to me as well, which was, if I want to show the work on paper, where's it going to go?
But why couldn't it have gone on the wall?
Well, it could have gone on the wall, and then there would have been this massive cost of framing or pinning, and I didn't like either of those solutions, not just financially but also visually. It would have made it too precious. And it's not to say the work doesn't have value, but it's just to say that this might be a more interesting way to experience it, and work with this L shape, which is also very odd, to not have the Psalter room open and to deal with this L. So then you've got this very short journey, and the wallpaper becomes your end point. So you have to keep going back and forth between that. So that was a massive risk, putting the work on the floor, and none of us really knew whether that would work. And it turned out it's become a thing now that characterises this project that I couldn't have. So I suppose the challenge is to keep experimenting with the work once it's made in how it's staged, which again is not necessarily how somebody else would approach the problem.
How are we doing for time?
think we should start rounding up.
Questions, I think.
Yeah.
I've got lots of stuff I'd like to ask you. Yeah, so should we take some questions from the floor? We don't have a roving mic, so just project it.
I have a question, but it's for Greg and John.
Oh, great.
Oh, yeah. Greg, can you tell us a bit more how this was for you, basically? Because this is an epic project. You've got to know each other now over, when did you first
2 years, maybe?
Yeah.
How's it been? What have you taken from it?
It's a lot of fun. I get asked that a lot, actually. So people ask, why would a scientist do art? Does that have any kind of relevance to what you're doing? Does it help in any way? And I think that it definitely does. And I think that, so science is a very kind of technical, jargon-loaded thing. It's quite complicated. And talking to John and interacting with John and talking about the art has really kind of made myself and the lab really focus on what our questions really are. Have we got them straight in our minds? Can we explain them without technical jargon? Does everybody have the right end of the stick? Are we all on the same page? Simplifying things and talking to an informed lay person is really helpful in that regard. So for us, I think that's the main outcome, the way to have a conversation about our work, our research questions, our goals, our methods, that doesn't, just involve other scientists. And that's a very valuable thing for us. And I think, to be perfectly honest, it's been, in some ways, quite a selfish thing for us because it has really helped. And we're not just doing this for John, we're very much doing it for ourselves as well.
And I think that's the same in reverse, in the sense of I get off on the fact that I can have the conversations with scientists rather than artists. That's a nice release, rather than just talking shop all the time.
Right.
And also, maybe I could interject as a funder. It sounds really reductive to encourage people to think about a pitch, but I mean, John's used the word hook already. Greg's referenced the way you reframe, rethink your lines of questioning. And obviously, when you're being pitched at as a funder, you do always encourage people to work on that pitch. And I think when you've got such a maximalism of ideas and the seriality and the kind of long build up to this project that you brought with this one, being able to kind of anticipate the knotty moments and construct a pitch that can navigate that and actually nail it is really, it's kind of part of the, I suppose, the pizzazz of your work, that it can do that. And I don't mean that in a shallow way, like it gives a lot of, well, it builds confidence in the funder that what you're claiming you want to do is actually going to cut through.
Sure, because it's high risk.
Yeah.
This isn't the fly's eye version of the thing. So you don't know what the work is going to be when you set out. You can hope, but it's probably going to go on another course.
Of course, and we want that, but the kind of the flex and resilience that's in that punchiness of the pitch inspires quite a lot of confidence, I think.